I love games which let you build your own character to explore the world with. Being able to come up with a backstory, choose a specific playstyle to match, and then go through the game in a unique way always brings a warm feeling to my heart. And it's why I really love the Fallout and Elder Scrolls series. But they're not the only games that can allow this approach, so I decided to check out some other games with character build potential. And from playing through them, it was clear that some were better than others, and it would take a brave, handsome, and genius IQ level individual to put them into a list video. So that's what we've got today, although this isn't the standard ranking system just from worst to best. Instead, I came up with a special rating system from which to score all the games. I judge equipment, talking about weapons and armour the game contains, skill trees, how you go about levelling the characters you play, role-playing, how freely the game allows you to take different paths throughout it, rather than locking you into always being the generic hero. And finally, there's backstory. Does the game provide the freedom to have you create your own intricate past while also having enough lore from which to make a rough structure? So every game in the list will be rated out of 5 for equipment, skill trees, role-playing, and backstory, granting a total ESRB rating out of 20. I'm very proud to have come up with this rating system, which will stand out from the crowd and be in no way confused with any other rating. Anyway, explanation out of the way, let's get started with the lowest rated game on the list, Risen. I had a lot of fun playing Risen for this video, but it has some very clear flaws that have left it firmly in last place. Overall, the equipment in the game is very basic and straightforward. There's bows, axes, staves, and a bunch of other generic weapon types, but there's very little in way of variation for them. As for armour, well, I was stuck in the starting rags for the first 7 hours, before finally getting a set of basic robes which weren't exactly anything to get excited over. Likewise, the skills you unlock aren't anything all but exciting. Lockpicking, the ability to sneak, being better with a certain type of weapon, it's very surface level stuff for the most part. The one interesting thing about how skills work though is that you don't just pick a new perk at every level like you would in most games. Instead, leveling up grants you learning points, which you can spend, alongside gold, on skill trainers, who can teach you specific skills, leveling them up. While quite a novel system that kinda makes sense in a logical way, it does really prevent how you build your character, as you need to save money for the skills and hunt down the right person to teach you the right skill. Some trainers are also locked away in areas that are story locked, so there's very specific routes you'll have to take to build up your character how you want. As for these routes, well, it's really just a case of picking which faction you want to side with. Either go with the rebels and head down the thief path, or go with the side of order, becoming either a warrior monk or a wizard. While these faction choices are very significant for how the game plays, this isn't what you should be expecting for most quests. Normally you just do the quest as intended, or you never complete it. And when it comes to talking to characters, you're normally just expending every dialogue option, as opposed to choosing which one you want to say. Finally, we have the backstory, and this game almost does it perfectly. You start out as a stowaway aboard a ship that wrecks, and you awaken on an island. This gives you a huge openness as to why you were on that ship and what led you to that moment. Plus, Risen does a very good job of showcasing its factions and their ideals, also granting a bit of insight into the larger world. The only problem when it comes to backstory is there's no character creator. Yeah, this rough-looking straggly dude is who you play as. No personalisation as to how you look or sound. You also don't get a name, but this is a positive, as people will just call you Stranger, or something similar to identify you when needed. Overall, it's certainly not the greatest, but there's some potential for a few different builds within the game. Next on the list is Death Trash. This game has a reasonable variety of weapons, and they do a good job of feeling different to each other. The game also has one equipped slot for melee and one for ranged, meaning you get to have both equipped at once, which can help with making a slightly hybrid character who can focus on both. However, with limited ammo, a lack of uniques, and not much else in the way of equipment, this is as good as it gets. As for skill trees, they're solid, but the game is pretty short, which means you'll quickly go through them. Additionally, the skills are very straightforward, so you're not looking at getting any cool perks, just boosting the basics upon level up. The size of the game also somewhat affects role-playing and backstory, as there's not a ton of content right now, which just makes for less to do. With limited lore and only a handful of interactable characters, you don't get much role-playing, and a backstory can be tricky to create, as despite having a fairly open-ended past, it's an unfamiliar world which can be difficult to write a character for. On the bright side, this game is still in early access, so it's the one on the list with real room to improve on these scores. Just depends on how the rest of the development goes. A game that is finished is Dragon Age Origins, the first of the Dragon Age series. This one's a bit of a, yeah, it's decent game overall. There's a variety of equipment that helps fit in with build archetypes, but rarely are anything too amazing or noteworthy. For skills, I personally am not a huge fan of the skill trees in this game, but they do a competent job of letting you craft a character to head down a certain path. However, the party mechanic does make it so you'll be nudged towards supplementing what other party members can do, or countering their weaknesses. You also only get to pick from skills that come from a class you picked at the very start of the game, so no real hybrid classes to go for. Personally, the attributes part is the section of leveling I thought was best, as it's simple and straightforward while having a significant change on how your character will end up, and even influences which skills you can unlock. As for role-playing, there are plenty of choices littered throughout the game, but in the end, you are the hero fighting back against the tide of evil making its way into the world, and the fact that you're the hero who walked a specific path never really changes. It's just the nuances of your character's personality that you really affect. And as for backstory, there are specific gameplay intros for the different races, where you get to pick how you start out, be it an elf from a woodland tribe, a noble human, or a dwarven thief. These are really fun little intro sections to play through, however they're very limiting in how you can write your character's past, as you play through a significant portion of it before reaching the main game start. You do get a little room to work with, but with only 6 choices for starts, you really have to work a lot to make your past fit in. In at 7th place we have Grim Dawn, an action RPG in the same vein as Diablo, but without the baggage of being made by Blizzard. Grim Dawn has a wide array of weapons with a huge range of shown effects and stats. Honestly, it was a bit much for me, and it didn't take long for me to start ignoring half the loot that dropped, only picking up items whenever I leveled up or beat a boss. But I'll take an abundance of loot over sparsity, and there's plenty of different types of equipment to deal with, so if you're a loot hound, you could happily spend hours in this game simply comparing stats and effects of various items. When it comes to skills, there's a decent number, however use of them can be a little tricky. There are also 2 classes you pick for each character, making every build a bit of a hybrid. You also unlock these classes very early, at level 5 and 10, which may not be as good as choosing it from the start, but it isn't far off. But as there's no initial character creator, this makes the very start all the same every time. Fortunately though, each class plays differently, helping to quickly differentiate characters within about an hour or so of game time. As for role-playing, there are several times where you get to make choices, and there's a faction system too. This said, the faction system is mostly just linear progression, where they'll like you or hate you more as you progress, but there are a couple of times where you can switch a faction from being friendly to hostile. When it comes to backstory, it's technically very open-ended, as you start out simply as somebody who was possessed and has forgotten their past. However, a lack of recent timeline lore for the game and not creating your character at the start of the game, but rather building as you play, can heavily hinder you when coming up with a character backstory. Our next game on the list is Borderlands 3, although basically everything I'm going to say would apply to Borderlands 2 just the same. The Borderlands franchise is great for equipment and skill trees, giving a wide variety of unique and standard weapons which have various fills, but which can be themed. Skill trees also have clear goals to them, sending you down different playstyles built for each character, but also allow you to mix and match a little, to make somewhat hybrid builds too. When it comes to leveling up and gathering loot, I'd say Borderlands 3 is gold standard. Unfortunately, it falls flat in the other 2 ratings. There's next to no role-playing, as the game just isn't built for that. At most, you'll get some choices with optional quest objectives, but that's about it. And when it comes to backstory, there's various clues about each character's past littered around the world. Plus, being named characters with bios and the like, you really aren't creating a character for a backstory, instead stepping into the shoes of a pre-made character and fleshing them out a bit more if you do want to make a backstory. Although it's not a series designed for that at all. We're at the halfway point now, and here we have the most recently released game of the list, Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk has some really cool weapons. Sharpened katanas, cover-penetrating sniper rifles, incendiary handguns. Night City truly is a playground of an arsenal, with a weapon to suit any character out there. Additionally, there's uniques, crafting, and upgrading, allowing for an additional layer of investment when it comes to organising your equipment. The point that really does a good job for this game though would be the cybernetics. While it can be a tricky process to build your character in such a way to actually get the best use of various cybernetics, not to mention how expensive they are, it's a great added bonus to each of your builds, whether you invest in it a little or a lot. Likewise, the skill trees are real solid. There's a wide variety of different paths to take, some truly great perks, and a strong variety between combat improvements, quality of life perks, and even some which can really change up how your build plays. Honestly, I'd be tempted to rate the skill trees as 4.5 or even 5 out of 5, if it wasn't for the fact that leveling up the skills can be a little annoying. Skill points and attribute points raise at different levels, and you'll sometimes find yourself needing to invest in areas you'd rather not, in order to get a specific perk or just pass some checks. This can make it feel clunky on occasion, but overall it's still a great skill system. And I wish I could say that about the roleplaying. This is by far the part of the game I'm most disappointed with to this day. For choices and consequences, you really don't get them for the most part. There's one really well done quest with an array of choices, and you get to pick your final ending, but that's about it. Every other quest is very linear, and it's more deciding which quest to participate in and which to ignore. You also can't access a lot of the game until you start going through the main story, and it's clear that the devs wanted to drive you down a story-driven narrative that they throw into an open-world game. As for backstory, the 3 life paths give a little guidance, but between them and the cinematic that plays after the intro, your recent backstory is not one you get to choose, just elements of your more distant past, which have to gel with your chosen path. I feel like the game very nearly gave some great freedom here, but rather than let you explore Night City as someone new to the area, CD Projekt Red decided to play a little video showing you making a name for yourself and getting situated. Like, honestly, that little intro cinematic is exactly the game I wanted Cyberpunk to be, but alas, 'twas not to be. Now onto a game that had a much more positive release, The Outer Worlds. This one's a real good balance score, as it's good in every single aspect, although not perfect in any. Equipment is relatively varied with several weapon types and uniques to deal with. However, plenty of weapons feel similar, and you'll be looking towards 1 or 2 specific weapons per build, with not a ton of leeway and variety for specific weapon types. A little bit of a problem of too many types of weapon categories in a game that isn't all that long. As for the skill trees, there are a few cool skills, however you don't get many perks by the time the game's over, and a lot of perks are more generalised as opposed to benefiting a specific area of the character, which isn't bad in games where you get lots of perks, but you're very limited in the Outer Worlds. When it comes to role-playing, things are pretty solid. Quests normally have multiple endings you can work towards, the game has various endings depending on which factions you decide to throw your lot in with, and you can even go on murder runs if you want to avoid the standard routes. However, the game also flows in chunks. You need to get past each point before progressing to the next section of the game, which does limit your freedom somewhat, as it can be hard to bypass certain sections. And as for a backstory, it's nearly a perfect clean slate. You were put on a ship for somewhat vague reasons to help recolonize the new planets, and the character creator does give you an aptitude which technically gives you some backstory, but it's not too big of a challenge to incorporate it into a character's past. The ship you're on is supposed to be full of great individuals, but who knows exactly what that means. We're into the top 3 territory now, and at this point I'll give you a little peek behind the curtain. I had a good dozen or so games lined up for this video, but boy oh boy did I run into problems, and continue to. Between games refusing to launch, refusing to record, or just generally being a bit of a pain, I quickly found myself struggling to test out 10 games in time for this video. So I didn't. I tested 9. And then I asked Kato Genesis what he thought about a recent game he'd been playing, Path of Exile.
There's a seemingly endless amount of equipment in Path of Exile to gear out your character however you see fit. As long as your character meets the attribute requirements, they can wear it. There's no class locking here. Nearly every piece of gear is customizable when it comes to sockets, enchantments, and even rarity, with more options as you work through more of the game's content. Gear and skills go hand in hand too, because the sockets and equipment are where your active skills go in the form of these multicolored gems. Having active skills be equipable instead of unlocked from a tree lets you fully customize the style of play that you want. Even better, gem slots can be linked together to include support gems to further modify how your moves function. Path of Exile is free to play and comes with a microtransaction shop too. Fortunately, it's just cosmetics and stash slots. Since making your character look stylish is part of their microtransaction model, I'll dock it half a point, but only half a point because the devs could have gotten away with monetizing more but chose not to. While loot is a huge aspect, so too is the massive player agency when it comes to classes and the passive skill tree. At the start, you have a choice between 6 classes, unlocking a 7th after playing through some of the story. While each class in Path of Exile has a starting strength, dexterity, and/or intelligence focus, the way you build each class is extremely open-ended in the form of one giant universal passive skill tree. The class you choose will determine your placement on said passive skill tree, and utilizing that side of your dominant attribute color. If you choose Marauder, for example, who is strength focused, they'll start on the strength side of the passive skill tree. As you gain passive skill points through quests and leveling up, you can then take the winding paths across the skill tree and spend points on passive bonuses to your attributes, skills, and specializations. Since the passive skill tree is overwhelmingly large, it also has the search function up top if you're looking for specific things to boost. So if you have a focus on two-handed weapons, you can use that to highlight two-handed weapon passives and then plan accordingly. The role-playing in Path of Exile is heavily focused on how you choose to dispatch enemies and the numerous bosses you'll encounter in the world's procedural dungeons, rather than choices made in the story. Being combat is the primary focus, there's an overwhelming amount of ways to stomp, disintegrate, eviscerate, and vaporize all manner of monstrosities in Path of Exile. That's where the majority of player agency lies, as I mentioned. Hideouts are an aspect that lends itself to a bit more role-playing, and you can unlock them in Act 2. These are safe houses that you can fully customize and decorate how you like, and even add story NPCs to use their services and sell to if need be. While not hugely impactful to the main story, being able to call a place your home and customize it how you like can add a bit more of a living in this world feeling. The story of Path of Exile is a tonally dark fantasy and well-voiced experience if you have the time to listen to the NPCs exposit at you, with the option to return whenever when you want to hear more. The way this game functions, though, has the player feeling a bit more like a hyper-violent mercenary at times, rather than the protagonist. Finally, as for backstory, you get a short paragraph when you choose your class, but your appearance at Lion Eye's Watch as a fresh-faced exile lets you choose basically any history that you want for your character, in the sense of, that was my old life, and my character uses these skills because of it.
I also let Kato score this game, and I have a feeling he's a little more generous with the points than my cynical self is, so despite our next game having the exact same score, it wins on that factor. Also because it's my video, so yeah. Pillars of Eternity is not a game I really enjoyed playing, but it sure does score high. There's a decent variety of weapons and armour, including some uniques. However, nothing's too flashy, expect to be using a lot of typical weaponry and apparel that you'd expect in a fantasy game. Leveling involves a variety of stats, traits, skills and so on, giving a lot of choices as you progress. However, it's rather tricky to plan out a building game, and can be a little overwhelming. The attribute system is a standout part to me, being very similar to how you might build a character in D&D. Skills also do a good job of being straightforward enough to grasp while affecting how your character plays. When it comes to class unlocks and talents, things start getting a bit all over the place. You really need to have played as the exact character you want to build once before to get to grips with it all, and this can make the game quite the time sink before you can start putting solid builds together. On to roleplaying now, and there's plenty of dialogue options within conversations. Plus, there's some factions with reputation levels, which is a good sign. But you do get guided down the right path a lot, and while there are multiple endings, the main story follows the same basic path. As for backstory, it's pretty open-ended. You're a foreigner to these lands, and some dialogue options can indicate your past, but you can mostly avoid this impacting what you've already decided. When first creating your character, you will also need to pick your race and culture, which can guide you a little with the backstory without being too limiting when writing your character's past. It's more so an aspect to integrate rather than needing a defining character point. And finally, we have the number 1 game, the top dog, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. Or Re-Reckoning if you're playing the remaster. But they're basically the same game, so either one is fine. I'm just ruining the dramatic reveal of the game, aren't I? Just look, this game's amazing, alright? Equipment variety is good, crafting allows you to customise things, there's a small variety of weapon types with various effects plus legendary/unique sets that can add on new effects to make characters even stronger or more specialised. The skill tree is great, giving you some basic stats for non-combat abilities, and 3 skill trees, Might, Sorcery and Finesse, which can be specialised or split between depending on if you want to be a pure build or a hybrid. Honestly, the levelling system is one of the best I've dealt with, due to being able to respec, having different playstyles really feel unique, and the destinies that you get depending on how many points you put into a tree, helping to structure things even more, and give you some really cool badass names. As for role-playing, there's a lot of side factions to join that suit various different character archetypes, but aren't limited to only those types, as any character can join any faction. As for choices and consequences within quests, there's generally not that many, but every once in a while you'll get something significant. The game even sometimes lets you take the evil path, and is happy to reward you for doing so. Like seriously, this game contains one of my favourite quests, where you can save a village, or brutally murder all of them, and both are 100% valid choices. It's beautiful. And as for backstory, it's mostly open-ended, although the very end of the game does give you a little pre-constructed backstory which can potentially clash with what you come up with, but it is technically just a small selection of what happened at the end of your life. And there we have it, 10 games for build makers that aren't Fallout or Elder Scrolls. There's a good variety of types of games here, so I'm sure there's at least one which will appeal to you, and chances are you didn't know about all of them, so there's something new to try out. A huge thank you to Katogenesis for helping with this video. Over on his channel he's made similar lists about games for Fallout fans, plus we host a podcast together there every other week, where we discuss the latest news in gaming, so check that out if you just can't get enough of our voices. Also, I talk normally over there because I'm not reading from a script at 2 in the morning. It's much better, and natural sounding, and just good. As always, thanks for watching. Sarge out.